You have been sold a lie. We were told that some cities are permanent, that their cultural weight makes them immune to the laws of structural decay. For 2 millennia, Rome was that ultimate exception, the definitive dream of the Western world. Emperors paved it in marble, poets surrendered their lives to its memory, and every subsequent generation has made the journey to stand inside the Colosseum, seeking to touch something that could never fall. But the data tells a very different story. If you look past the glossy promotional brochures and examine the real numbers shifting beneath the surface in 2025 and accelerating straight into 2026, you notice a quiet, systemic fracturing. The legend and the reality have stopped matching. We exist to document that precise gap, the hollow space between what an institution promises and what it actually delivers. The year 2019 appeared to be the absolute zenith of the myth, with the city welcoming over 14 million international arrivals. The Trevi Fountain was compressed under such a dense wall of human bodies that the water itself was barely visible. The Spanish Steps were rendered impassable by sunrise, and every tourist facing Trattoria operated at absolute straining capacity. It was an economy entirely dependent on its own mythological momentum. Then the global shutdown occurred, followed by an aggressive reopening that mainstream tourism boards assumed would spark a seamless, linear recovery. It did not. While the raw volume of arrivals technically rebounded, the internal composition of those numbers shifted fundamentally. The high-value traveler, the visitor who rents a boutique suite for 2 weeks, hires registered local guides, dines at authentic establishments, and invests capital back into the community, has quietly evacuated the ecosystem. They are rerouting their capital to Athens, to Lisbon, or to Tokyo. Cities that, as corporate luxury travelogues quietly note, still possess the infrastructure to welcome human beings rather than merely process them. Rome, for the most critical segment of the global economy, has transformed into a transaction. This is the classic anatomical marker of late-stage urban stagnation, a mechanical failure where the brand outlasts the physical product. It is a structural loop that played out in Constantinople before its collapse, where magnificent monuments stood surrounded by entirely broken local infrastructure. It resurfaced in Victorian London as imperial grandeur collided with systemic internal neglect, and it manifested in modern Detroit, where the myth of industrial invincibility masked a total failure to invest in basic municipal survival long before the assembly lines stopped. When a city begins running exclusively on the inertia of its reputation, reality must become catastrophic before the collective mind updates its expectations. In 2026, that historical inertia is finally running out of fuel. The first crack always appears where the infrastructure meets the pavement. Rome's transit network is tasked with moving nearly 3 million permanent residents alongside a daily peak influx of 400,000 visitors. To accomplish this, the city relies on just 2 fully operational subway lines built in the 1970s, which navigate only a fraction of the urban geography. A third route, Line C, has been trapped in construction loops since 2006. It has taken 20 years of funding and delays, yet remains fundamentally incomplete. The mechanism behind this paralysis is simple yet devastating. The city is literally built on top of its own dead self, layer upon layer. Every time a modernization initiative begins, a worker's shovel strikes a 2,000-year-old structural ruin, freezing public works for months of bureaucratic and archaeological evaluation. The historical inheritance is extraordinary, but has become completely paralyzing to contemporary survival. On a summer afternoon under a 40-degree heatwave, a traveler arriving at Termini Station faces a 90-minute taxi queue, a surface bus network that operates late by systemic default, and a subway system that requires constant transfers to access any major economic or cultural hub. For an aging demographic seeking to experience the city's heritage over a 4-day window, this ceases to be a minor friction. It becomes a definitive deterrent. The macroeconomic consequences are already mapping out across digital indicators. Relative search volume for Rome on major global travel engines has steadily degraded against comparable Mediterranean destinations for 4 consecutive years. Boutique agencies based in London and Frankfurt, managing high-net-worth itineraries averaging €8,000 per trip, report a documented 18% diversion of bookings away from the Lazio region toward the Greek and Adriatic coasts. These are precisely the capital-injecting demographics the municipality needs to retain. Yet they are the first to exit an environment that fails to meet basic standards of contemporary livability. The secondary fracture is deeper, driven by an acute crisis of over-tourism resentment. In mid-2024, the City Council enacted a wave of emergency ordinances designed to police human behavior in the historic core. Kunis food on historic staircases carried fines, reaching €400. Sitting on monument perimeters became an actionable offense, and dragging wheeled luggage through designated historic stone corridors was outright prohibited. While presented as reasonable preservation efforts, these desperate policies paint an undeniable picture of a municipality that has turned aggressively hostile toward the very industry keeping its fiscal balance sheet alive. The human cost of this friction is the literal hollowing out of the local population. 1970, the historic center enclosed within the ancient Aurelian walls housed approximately 250,000 living, working Romans. Today, that number has plummeted beneath 80,000. Residential housing has been systematically cannibalized by speculative short-term rental conversions and corporate hypertourism, transforming a living, breathing capital into an uninhibited open-air museum. The community has been displaced by a stage set. This brings us directly to the foundational economic layer that mainstream financial commentary consistently avoids. The Italian economy has been trapped in a state of structural stagnation for 3 decades, with real GDP growth averaging less than 1% annually since the turn of the century. Youth unemployment routinely doubles the European Union baseline, and a continuous 15-year trend of net domestic emigration means the nation's brightest minds are fleeing the country entirely. Italy is aging faster than almost any other developed G7 nation on Earth, on track to shed 12% of its total population by mid-century. As the capital city, Rome concentrates these structural failures. It remains the seat of a notoriously complex bureaucracy, where launching a commercial enterprise requires an average of 54 days and dozens of disparate layers of state approval. The Colosseum, despite being the single most visited cultural monument on the European continent, is managed by a rigid public entity, historically trapped in budget constraints and endless ministerial gridlock. The capital it generates is routinely swallowed by state administrative deficits rather than being reinvested into the city's crumbling physical foundation. The physical evidence of this fiscal starvation is visible to anyone walking the streets, without the distorting lens of romantic expectation. Scaffolding remains fixed to historic facades for so many consecutive years that it blends permanently into the local architecture. Fountains operate erratically due to degraded water pressure systems. Major museum wings remain closed indefinitely under the endless guise of restoration, and public plazas designed for imperial grandeur are left to weather under minimal maintenance. A former economic policy analyst for the European Union summarized the situation directly. Rome is surviving entirely on an inheritance it stopped contributing to in the 1980s. The wealth was vast, so it lasted decades, but an inheritance that is exclusively spent and never replenished carries an absolute terminal date. We must be precise. Rome is not on a trajectory to become an abandoned post-industrial wasteland like Detroit. The historic scale and cultural weight are fundamentally different, but the underlying mechanics of structural decay remain identical. Great urban centers do not collapse overnight. They degrade through small, unheeded signals, a slow exit of high-value consumers, a neighborhood hollowed out of its residents, a continuous failure to upgrade basic utility grids, and a political class that chooses to market a myth rather than fix a pipe. By the time the mainstream media names the decline, the structural rot has already been operational for 30 years. In the case of Rome, the transition is moving toward a highly specific cautionary endpoint, the total transformation into a museum city. It is entering the exact same socioeconomic curve that Venice entered decades ago, where the resident population was systematically traded for tourism revenue until the living community ceased to exist. And this is only the beginning of what the data reveals. The machine that once produced wealth is now producing something entirely different, a self-cannibalizing landscape where the pursuit of short-term tourist capital systematically dismantles the urban mechanics required for long-term survival. The Eternal City is no longer functioning as a living metropolis. It has been converted into a finite resource being extracted to the point of structural exhaustion. When a city's primary economic output shifts from productivity to preservation, The internal engines that sustain a society begin to seize. The data maps out this transformation with clinical clarity. Across the historic center, retail vacancies have climbed to an unprecedented 24% since 2023. But these are not empty storefronts in the traditional sense. They are physical spaces undergoing a rapid, predatory mutation. Traditional workshops, bookstores, and neighborhood grocery stores are disappearing at a rate of 3 per week, replaced instantly by generic luggage storage lockers, automated souvenir kiosks, and low-tier fast food counters. The concrete human consequence is that a retired Roman living on Via del Corso must now take a 30-minute bus ride just to purchase a fresh loaf of bread or find a pharmacy that stocks basic medication simultaneously. The short-term rental market has achieved total saturation. Inside the ancient Aurelian walls, residential occupancy rates for actual local families have plummeted to an all-time low of 31%. Over two-thirds of the available housing stock is now permanently listed on digital hospitality platforms, driving average residential rental costs up by 42% in less than 3.5 years. The concrete human consequence is that a primary school teacher or an emergency room nurse, earning an average local salary of €1,400 per month, can no longer afford to live within 40 minutes of their workplace, forcing a critical exodus of essential civil servants from the urban core. This demographic shift has triggered an immediate crisis in the city's fundamental public institutions. Over 40 public schools within the central municipal districts have closed their doors or been consolidated since 2022 due to a total lack of neighborhood children. The playgrounds have been paved over or repurposed to accommodate outdoor restaurant seating for transient crowds. The concrete human consequence is that the few remaining young families are isolated in an environment entirely devoid of community infrastructure. Raising children in a neighborhood where their neighbors change every 48 hours. To understand how this looks on the ground, you have to look away from the monuments and focus on the small, handwritten signs taped to the shutters of side street businesses. In the Trastevere district, long romanticized as the authentic heart of Roman working-class life, a small leather repair shop operated by the same family for 74 years recently locked its doors permanently. The owner, a third-generation artisan named Marco, spent his final months paying a commercial rent that had tripled to match the real estate valuation of the adjacent cocktail bars. We spoke to him on his final afternoon as he packed a lifetime of specialized iron tools into cardboard boxes. He didn't blame the landlords or the tourists directly. He pointed to the fundamental loss of local utility. He noted that when a neighborhood loses its residents, it loses its purpose. He spent his days watching thousands of people drag-wheeled suitcases past his window, but none of them needed a pair of boots resoled or a leather briefcase repaired. They needed cheap plastic power adapters and disposable ponchos. His business did not fail because his craft had degraded. It failed because the community that required his craft had been entirely erased around him. A block away, a long-term resident named Elena watches the daily transformation of her apartment building from her third-floor balcony. Of the 12 units in her historic complex, she is now the last remaining permanent tenant. The other 11 have been retrofitted with digital smart locks and identical minimalist furniture, operating as highly profitable, unstaffed micro-hotels. Her daily life is defined by a constant cycle of lost visitors buzzing her intercom at 3 in the morning, the mechanical rattle of suitcases on the stone courtyard below, and the absolute absence of a familiar face to check on her when the building's water pressure drops. The city she was born in has not been conquered. It has simply been leased out to the highest bidder, one night at a time. This internal displacement creates a secondary economic trap that the municipality is entirely unequipped to manage. As the tax base shifts from stable, resident-earned income to volatile, consumption-based tourist fees, the city's financial stability becomes deeply fragile. The revenue generated by the municipal tourist tax, inflated heavily in recent years, is entirely absorbed by the soaring cost of managing the physical waste, security, and crowd control generated by 30 million annual visitors. The city is spending its entire budget merely reacting to the presence of the crowd, leaving zero capital to repair the structural foundations underneath. The result is a landscape of permanent, low-grade crisis that manifests in ways that are impossible to hide from view. It is a city where garbage collection is treated as an intermittent luxury rather than a basic public utility. where main thoroughfares are left with asphalt so degraded that local scooter riders map their daily commutes around hazardous potholes, where public parks are systematically closed to prevent the injury of pedestrians from unmaintained falling pine trees. The infrastructure is not failing due to a sudden natural disaster. It is being ground down to dust by the sheer friction of overuse and underinvestment. What we are witnessing here is not a random sequence of municipal misfortunes. This decline follows a rigid, predictable trajectory that has been mapped across urban history before. It is the exact sequence that occurs when a society mistakes a high volume of foot traffic for genuine economic health. It is a structural pattern that reveals its final outcome to anyone willing to look across the geopolitical landscape. The most alarming aspect of a great city's unraveling is not the physical decay itself, but the aggressive institutional silence that surrounds it. There exists a profound paradox at the heart of contemporary Rome. The structural breakdown is entirely visible to anyone walking its streets, yet it is systematically denied by the official narrative. While the municipality issues press releases celebrating record-breaking tourist arrivals and soaring hospitality revenues, the underlying civic fabric is quietly dissolving. The state has chosen to mistake the rapid extraction of historical capital for genuine economic vitality, creating a culture of metric-driven optimism that deliberately masks a terminal trajectory. This denial is maintained through a carefully orchestrated spin of public data. When the Italian National Institute of Statistics reports a surge in regional GDP, it routinely omits the critical reality that this growth is heavily concentrated in low-wage, non-productive service sectors that offer zero upward mobility for the local population. The reality of a shrinking tax base and a departing professional class is buried beneath a mountain of raw, uncontextualized arrival numbers. To acknowledge that the city is hollowing itself out would be to admit that the current economic model is fundamentally unsustainable, a realization that Rome's political and financial stakeholders are entirely unequipped to confront. Beneath this surface-level optimism lies a distinct chilling effect that stifles honest internal critique. Independent urban planners, demographers, and economic analysts who attempt to publish data regarding the true scale of the city's depopulation find their research marginalized or excluded from state-funded policy discussions. Local journalists who report on the operational dysfunction of the transit network or the environmental toll of unmanaged waste face immediate pushback from tourism syndicates and municipal PR departments, who accuse them of damaging the national brand. The conversation surrounding the capital's future has been entirely sanitized, reduced to an ongoing marketing campaign where dissent is treated as a form of economic treason. When you talk to researchers off the record, the tone changes from public compliance to grave certainty. We spoke with a senior demographic analyst who spent over 15 years tracking Mediterranean population shifts for a prominent European think tank. She noted that the numbers they are forced to present publicly are carefully selected to project stability, but the raw, unedited datasets paint a terrifying picture of a city that has crossed a major demographic tipping point. In private circles, there is an explicit admission that the historic core has transitioned from a living community to a corporate asset, and that no political mechanism currently exists with the power or the will to reverse the process. The implications of this structural surrender extend far beyond the ancient city walls. Rome is not merely a tourist destination, it is the administrative and political anchor of the entire Italian peninsula. When the capital city of a major G7 nation ceases to function as an engine of domestic productivity and transforms into a passive museum, the entire national economy suffers a severe systemic drag. The continuous diversion of public funds to manage the immediate friction of over-tourism starves the rest of the country of the capital, required to build modern industrial, technological, and educational infrastructure. The systemic failure of Rome is the systemic failure of the state, written in real time across a landscape of broken promises. If this trajectory is allowed to run to its logical conclusion, the consequences will ripple across the entire Mediterranean basin. A nation that relies exclusively on the monetization of its past eventually loses its capacity to invent a future. As the professional class continues to exit, the region risks falling into a state of permanent economic dependency, where a highly educated youth population is reduced to working as low-tier hospitality labor for a transient global elite. The great institutions that once defined Western civilization are being converted into luxury experience products, a transformation that leaves the state deeply vulnerable to the next major global economic shock. This is the uncomfortable reality that mainstream analysis refuses to name. The decline of an empire does not announce itself with a sudden dramatic breach of the gates. It manifests as a slow, comfortable adaptation to a lower standard of survival. It is found in the collective decision to stop fixing what is broken, to prioritize the illusion of success over the grueling work of structural renewal, and to trust that a famous name will indefinitely protect a failing system from the laws of economic gravity. The brand remains pristine, while the machine underneath grinds itself into a halt. We are left watching a magnificent monument running on the fumes of an ancient inheritance, a city trapped in a permanent negotiation between its immortal myth and its decaying reality. The world will continue to make the pilgrimage, the cameras will continue to flash, and the marketing campaigns will continue to insist that everything is permanent. But as the last local grocery stores close, as the trains run late by default, and as the community continues its quiet retreat into the periphery, a deeper question emerges from the silence of the stones. How long can a civilization survive on the memory of what it used to be, before it realizes there is nothing left inside the gates?